Hello everybody, this is Albert with Green Tea House. I hope you're doing well today. Today we're going to conclude this series, How England Stole Tea from China, and talk about its long-lasting effects. Now before we begin, if you haven't done so already, please come visit us at the tea store. Also subscribe and hit the notification bell so these episodes come fresh to you, and post a comment. So I'll make sure that I put a banner up here for I believe there's 3 parts before this. This is a quadrilogy. And today we're going to talk about the long-lasting effects of what Robert Fortune did. So please, before you watch this, put it in context, go watch the 3 other episodes if you haven't done so already. So Fortune's expedition was a success in that the black tea seeds that he got in China were able to be sent to India and properly cultivated over there. And so that trip was seen as a success. Now we're going to leave Fortune. He goes back to China a couple more times. He actually goes later under the employ of the United States, because prior to the Civil War, the United States was hoping to get into this cash cow that is the tea market, and they were wanting to plant tea in the South. And so they hired him as a private employee to do that. And things seemed to be going well, but then he was ceremoniously fired right before the Civil War, and then the Civil War kind of ruined a lot of those plans. And then eventually he died about 10 years later, a very wealthy man. And we talked about in episode 2 or episode 1 how Fortune came from Scottish background, meager background. He ended up dying with a lot of money due to his mostly, let's be honest, his subterfuge. So why is this episode of history so important? It's so important because it changed the course of tea history. Now, prior to the 1840s, the West was consuming tea. And we've talked about it in the history of tea playlist, which I'll put up here. Tea got to the West really in the late 1600s, and it was really the Dutch that were the first to popularize. And that's why we call it tea, because the Dutch called it tea. We have an episode here why in certain parts of the world tea is called tea or te, or some derivation of that. In some parts of the world called cha, because it largely depended on the history and also which port that the tea was being taken from in China. But either way, we at this point had about 200 years of tea history in the West. And the majority of that time, it was drank by the upper classes, and it was a majority green tea. They were drinking green tea. And remember, they thought green tea and black tea came from different plants. They didn't know it was the same Camellia sinensis plant. But they were drinking green tea. And believe it or not, they were drinking it with milk and sugar. And so black tea, which is one, if not the latest innovation of the 6 categories of tea, was something that came about later on in tea history. We know we've had tea since the Bronze Age. I'll put a banner up here for 4,500 years of tea history in 10 minutes. So black tea became the thing in the West. And the tipping point really was this episode. And that's why it's so important. Why? Because Fortune discovered, as I mentioned, I think in episode 2, that the Chinese were using dyes to make the green tea look more green. And unfortunately, they didn't know. They weren't trying to poison the West, because that would be bad for business. But they were using a pigment that was poisonous, that was problematic. So Fortune, given that he was able to go to the hinterland and actually see tea processing, reported on that. And so that was one of the things that changed the taste preferences of the West. The other big thing was that black tea became preponderant, partly because black tea was the successful type of tea that got cultivated in India. Remember, his first shipment of green tea failed completely. I didn't even get there and well intact, but the black tea did. And so at this point, India now, after a couple decades, was able to grow and supply the British Empire and its former empires, the United States. The United States drank tons of tea per capita. We have this idea that after the Boston Tea Party, America turned its attention to coffee, and this will be a separate episode. But no, going into the late 1880s, really into the early 1900s, per capita coffee and tea consumption was equal. So why did things change to black? Well, India now had a black tea supply. They knew how to grow black tea. Remember, the Fortune was able to hire Chinese people who were tea experts to come and cultivate, and they taught the Indians there and the white people how to do it, and so forth. And so now that India didn't have to go all the way to China to get the tea, green tea was not as popular anymore given the poisoning thing. White tea, yellow tea, these were really not that popular. Oolongs were relatively popular, but as a whole, the market shift went to black. Now, what else do you have going on at this time? The British Empire was not only looking at tea as a mass cash cow commodity, they were looking at coffee, and we'll talk about this maybe in a future episode, but they were also looking at sugar. Sugar was a humongous cash cow, among other things like tobacco and so forth. But sugar was a cash cow. So they had so much sugar. Much of the sugar was cultivated in the Caribbean, like Jamaica, big British Empire, holding. So they had this combo of like, we got a lot of sugar and we have a lot of tea. Oh, and coincidentally, wow, black tea, they didn't know it's 100% oxidized or whatnot. They didn't know the theoflavonoids, theorubigens that are in 100% oxidized tea, which is black tea. But it's like, oh, this actually tastes better with sugar and with milk than green tea. So they had to dump a lot of this sugar. Plus sugar, of course, as it is still today, very popular, tastes great. And so you saw the taste preferences in the English Empire, and really you could say in Europe, Western Europe in particular, change to black tea. So black tea became the thing in the late 1800s. What's coinciding in the late 1800s? This is peak Victorian era. Queen Victoria is the queen, 1837 to 1903. I still remember that. She's the queen during this time. And so we see high tea becoming very popularized. High tea was popularized going back to Charles II's wife, Catherine of Braganza. She was Portuguese. She brought that in the 1660s when she was brought to England, but really it was popularized in the 1700s. But by the 1800s, the high tea became like a high art. Also, what you had was now the lower classes were drinking black tea and they enjoyed it. And the factory owners, think of this is the Industrial Revolution period, they loved it because prior to that, these factory workers were drinking ale every morning. And that's not good, right? You don't want your workers coming drunk and whatnot. So tea provided that stimulation that you do get, the moderate amount of caffeine from tea. And so you saw that the factories started providing tea breaks, started providing tea with bread and butter and all these things. So tea became really big. So you saw this growth in the tea market. Now India could grow English tea. So now England was saving tons of money because the old system, remember, was very disadvantageous to the East India Company. They were just hemorrhaging out silver. And even after they started growing opium and dumping it into China, they still didn't have a net profit overall. So now that they're growing in their own empire, they could keep the costs low. The shipping was much lower. Then they opened the Suez Canal in the 1860s, which cuts into the time to get the tea to the West. And so, and now you see the middle class and the lower class buying tea because tea's prices are dropping. In the 1700s, it was very expensive, but now it's dropping. So you see this convergence. And so what's the effect of fortune and the industrial espionage they did? Look at today. Most Americans, if they're drinking tea, they're drinking black tea. Where are they getting that from? That is a vestige of what this episode was about. English tea preferences changed to black tea because of the ability for England to start growing tea in India and then later in Kenya and Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and all these places. So the preferences change. So now you fast forward to the late 1800s, the early 1900s, the creation of the tea bag. You go through the 1950s, World War II, all to this time when people are drinking tea, they're not drinking yellow. Okay, the West is firmly entrenched in black tea. Iced tea, very popular export commodity. 80% of tea that's exported is used for iced tea. We talked about this before. It's CTC, it's crushed cherry curled, crappy tea. The fannings, the sawdust they use for iced tea, they're not using orthodox loose leaf black tea. But you see, iced tea comes from black tea. So there's this world where black tea dominates. And this is really the case in the West. Now, we're not talking about in India, we're not talking about this in Japan or in China, where they're still drinking a wide variety of the 6 categories of tea. But we're talking about the West. So up until really the 1990s, you see that when people are drinking Lipton, they're drinking black tea. And it's only in the last 30 years, and nay, I would really say, really the last 10 to 15 years with the age of the internet, now we see that changing. Now we see people embracing other categories of tea, partly because other categories of tea are becoming more popular. So you hear 10, 15, 20 years ago, really, you start hearing, oh, what's this green tea? Oh, it's lighter. Oh, it's really healthy for you. So now grocery stores slowly start to roll them out. 20 years ago, for you to get green tea, you had to go to a healthy grocery store. But now regular grocery stores are rolling this out. And then with the age of the internet, with the age of dissemination of information, with the age of sharing information, sharing history, people start learning about the history of tea. These are people who really care about tea. And so now you see the market shifting where, yes, 80% of tea exports is still for black tea because that's iced tea, and still the most popular black teas that are, the most popular teas that are exported out of Asia are still going to be for the English market. And the typical English family or anyone in the West is still drinking the most popular blends. And what are the most popular blends? English breakfast blends, Earl Grey, right? These are black teas, right? You go to a high tea party, whether it be at the Empress Hotel in Victoria, Canada, or one in New York or one in England, they're not rolling out yellow tea at the high tea, right? They're still rolling out black tea. But now with the age of the internet, now it's changed completely. And now you see that people are embracing the other categories of tea. There was a big pu'er awareness back in 2008 with the Beijing Olympics. So you see this change. But black tea is still entrenched, and it's entrenched because of Robert Fortune. So in closing, was Robert Fortune and the East India Company who hired him engaging in industrial espionage? Absolutely. Was it wrong what they were doing? Look, there's this thing called presentism, looking at the past through the prism of today and today's values. So you could look back at today or look back in the past from today's values and say that this was wrong. But at the time, it wasn't necessarily perceived to be wrong. It was, hey, we are losing money here. East India Company loses the monopoly on tea. They got to come up with something. They don't know anything about tea, how it's processed, and it's like fight or flight, right? They have to do something to save their own butt. And so they do this. Now, today, if someone breaks into the Coca-Cola company to steal the recipe, or Dr. Pepper to steal the recipe, that's industrial espionage. But in the 1840s, this concept really didn't exist. So we can look back and say, oh, the East India Company, what they did with this subterfuge, this deceit, was wrong. But might makes right, my friends, as they say, and it is what it is. And this is why we look at history. And the reason that this episode is so important, because it changed the course of tea history for us here in the West. And sadly, you could say that it changed the history of China in many ways, because the reason why the Chinese got doped up in opium is because the English were shipping opium from India, where it was grown, to China, and they were partly doing this to get the trade balance. So when we look at the first opium war, and this is very nerdy for you guys who don't know much history, the first opium war that England fought with China, with the Qing dynasty, we can say it was named the opium, but really it was a war over tea. It was a tea war. And ultimately, look what happened to China afterwards, right? They're getting so doped up in opium. The Qing dynasty is corrupt. Eventually, they're toppled in the early 1900s. And after a little time of democracy under Sun Yat-sen, then the communists are able to grow a foothold. And now communism, of course, is still there. So you can see all this kind of starts with Robert Fortune on some level. Guys, post in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care. God bless.